Teresa is important to us is not how well we know her, but how well we live the doctrine she teaches us. The measure for us who are Carmelites is not how well we know the rule, but how we live the rule. So, Dr. Mujica has taken that wonderful gift of humanism that literature gives us, that developing a keen moral sense, and applied it, I think, very well with the work for veterans. But her work in Spanish extends far beyond the work of St. Teresa. And in fact, one of the things I just happened to notice is that you've written a book on Frida how do you say her last name? Kahlo, yeah. And I've really never heard about her until the last year, and 2 or 3 times on National Public Radio. I've heard some very interesting programs. And of course, she's 20th century America, 20th century Mexican, and life in the United States for a while. So very broad field of studies, of which I think Teresa is simply one of the jewels in Barbara's crown. So I'd like to introduce now Dr. Bárbara Mujica.
But Teresa is a personal friend in a way that Frida Kahlo never could be. I want to clarify that I will be talking about the first communities after the death of Teresa. My original title that I sent in somehow got changed, but in the program. But I will be talking about the women who followed Teresa and brought the reform into France, Portugal, and the Low Countries. I have written about the early Teresian communities. I have a book called Teresa of Avila, Lettered Woman, and it's a history of the early foundations, her foundations, but through her letters, through an analysis of her letters. And that book is here, so that's my first commercial. And my second commercial of the day is I would like you to please mark your calendars. On October 16th, Georgetown is having a big Teresa celebration of her quincentennial. And I know Father Fernando said he was really tired of these things, but I'm not. And for me, it's my first one, and well, it's not I've been to quite a few of them, but it's the first one that I'm actually organizing, and it's just, we have a wonderful program with a library exhibition, a symposium, and a concert. Our orchestra director, Ángel Gil Ordóñez, is Spanish, and he is going to do a concert of Spanish music of Teresa's time. And then there will be a play about Teresa of Avila. So I am going to prove to you that what we heard this morning, that everything then was better and everything now is worse, is not true. Things were pretty bad. They were pretty bad. So Teresa de Avila died in 1582, as we know. On a trip to Seville, Jean de Bretigny, who was a French-Spanish Catholic activist, became enamored of the Discalced movement and undertook to bring the Carmelite reform to France. In Seville, he met Maria de San Jose, one of Teresa's closest friends, and wanted her for prioress of the first French convent. But political complications prevented him from carrying out that plan. And instead, in 1584, Maria de San Jose left for Portugal. Teresa had wanted Maria to succeed her as foundress, and Maria seemed to be on that track when she founded São Alberto, St. Albert, the first Discalced Carmelite convent in Lisbon. However, Maria was embroiled in a controversy with Nicolás Doria, the Discalced Carmelite provincial, which was going to muddy the situation. So some of you know Doria, because I heard some groans. Maria had accompanied Teresa to Beas in 1575, where both women met Jerónimo Gracián, in English called Gratian, but I just can't say it. It's going to be Gracián for this afternoon. who was to become another of St. Teresa's close associates and the order's first provincial. So in 1585, Doria, Teresa's former finance minister, succeeded Gracian as provincial and soon clashed with him over the issue of convent governance. Like St. Teresa, Gracian favored a policy of suavidad, or gentleness, in dealing with nuns, while Doria promoted a strict adherence to the rules. We were talking about rules this morning, and what they do. And Teresa thought that rules, as we heard this morning, existed to enable people to reach their full potential spiritually, that rules didn't exist for their own sake. Teresa had given prioresses considerable power over their convents, charging them with controlling their own finances, selecting their own novices, and choosing confessors for their nuns. But Doria did not approve of women exercising such power, and therefore took steps to reverse Teresa's policies. At the chapter meeting in Valladolid in 1587, Gracian took a stand against Doria and was supported by the chapter. The following year, Doria had Gracian charged with moral laxity and forbade Maria to write or speak to him. Because Doria thought that Gracian indulged prioresses and encouraged nuns to resent priestly authority, he modified Teresa's constitutions to limit the power of female prelates and bring them under clerical control. In 1590, with the support of Gracian and John of the Cross, Maria de San Jose and Ana de Jesus, prioress of the Madrid Carmel, audaciously went over Doria's head and appealed directly to Pope Sixtus V to preserve the 1581 constitutions in what came to be known as the Nuns' Revolt. Today, when we read about feisty nuns that really give the Vatican a headache, it didn't start now. So Pope Sixtus acceded to their request, but he died later that year. And the next Pope, Gregory XIV, imposed a compromise that largely reversed his predecessor. Doria retaliated against the rebels and their supporters, depriving Maria de San Jose of voice and vote and placing her under house arrest for 9 months. So she was incarcerated in the convent prison. Because Maria's challenge to authority has been seen as an embarrassment, most chronicles of the order hardly mention her, and little was known about her tenure in Portugal. However, in 2003, Isabel Morujão, a Portuguese scholar, brought Belchor de Santa Ana's Crônica de Carmelitas to the attention of scholars. Completed in 1628 by a friar who claimed to be Maria's personal friend, the work contains a wealth of information on Maria's activities in Portugal. Fray Belchor notes that even though Maria and her followers were fragile women, they served as example of manly resolve. We've heard about that this morning. To future Carmelite sisters. Not only were they rigorous in their penance and observance of the rule, they were experts in mental prayer, contemplation, and interiority. Maria followed Teresa's example by making gentleness her guiding tenet. Maria had come to understand that a religious house ran more smoothly when nuns or friars obeyed out of love rather than fear, a notion reflected in Maria's advice for the governance of nuns. She writes, "My first piece of advice to prioresses is to earn the hearts of your nuns." Given the importance Maria placed on suavidad, aspects of life in San Alberto are somewhat surprising. At times, Maria put the nuns to tests of obedience, commanding them to perform tasks that seemed blatantly unreasonable. For example, once when a novice, following Maria's orders, sewed a perfectly made habit, Maria commanded her to take it apart and reconstruct it. The novice did so with demonstrations of joy, thereby demonstrating her mastery of obedience. Another time, After a novice who worked in the refectory had tidied up as she was commanded, the nun in charge messed up the room and then reprimanded her for the disorder. Being a beginner, the novice protested. To teach her a lesson, Maria had her remove her habit and refrain from talking to anyone except the cats in the courtyard, with which she was to eat on all fours. After the novice completed this penance for 8 days, the other nuns grew to love her. That's what Maria wrote. Every Friday and sometimes Thursdays as well, and every day during Lent and on other particular occasions, the nuns were whipped so that they could share Christ's agony. So we don't do that anymore, I hope. They were also subjected to sleeping on hard planks and other mortifications. As Teresa had done, Maria staged scenes of martyrdom so that her daughters would understand the meaning of sacrifice. Rather than in a common room, nuns worked in their own cells to avoid succumbing to the dangers of gossip. They cultivated solitude and prayer in the tiny hermitages that were the hallmark of Discalced Carmelite monasteries. And the silence of the house was so great that each nun understood, writes Teresa, that she could speak only with God. Writes Maria. However, Maria did recognize the need for human contact and so permitted an hour of spiritual recreation after lunch, dinner, and in the evening. Poverty is the sister of humility, writes Fray Belchor, and so the nuns cultivated this virtue. The convent was extremely poor, but according to Maria, our Lord took care of the nuns' needs. On one occasion, a man to whom the convent owed 60,000 reis demanded them back. Maria begged God for help, and within an hour, a person appeared who gave her the 60,000 reis. Another time, the nuns had nothing but amaranth to eat. Unexpectedly, the extern brought in a pot of flounder, fresh, fried, and hot, which was enough for the whole community. As an act of thanks, the nuns carried the fish from the refectory to the choir, singing. Maria set an example by modeling poverty. In her clothing, cell, and food, she always chose the poorest. If another nun had a habit that was shabbier than hers, but they exchanged garments. Her breviary, rosary, and instruments of mortification were always the scruffiest of all. During this time, Protestants were staging incursions into the Netherlands. In 1586, Cardinal Albert, later governor of the Low Countries, commanded Gracian to receive some Flemish nuns who were being threatened by, quote, the evil heretics Luther and Calvin. When the Flemish nuns arrived, the Spanish nuns greeted them with elation and joy, writes Belchor. The Flems not only combined modesty and humility, but they also easily formed a perfect friendship with the angels, his word, of São Alberto. Maria was so competent, writes Fray Belchor, that when the cardinal needed to get a house in Alcántara ready for the Flemish nuns so that they could live with proper decency and enclosure, he entrusted the task to her, and of course she performed it with great perfection. In the meantime, Doria continues to harass Maria and Gracian. Doria's followers accuse Gracian, among other things, of sleeping in the beds of the nuns, of kissing them, and even of fathering a child with Maria. Once, writes Gracian, when a very old nun fainted from the heat and he put his arms around her to support her head, he was accused of hugging her. In March 1588, Gracian was deprived of voice and vote and sent to Madrid to face further disciplinary actions. Maria wrote numerous letters in his defense, but after Gracian had been formally charged with moral laxity, Doria again forbade her to write or speak to him. Portugal had come under Spanish rule in 1580 and was therefore drawn into the Anglo-Spanish War, started in 1585. In 1587, an Anglo-Dutch fleet raided the Spanish city of Cadiz, pillaging churches and homes, although sparing the populace. On its way back to England, the fleet disembarked at Faro, Portugal, which the invaders burned to the ground. The following year, the English defeated the Spanish Armada, but soon afterward, the Spanish fleet defeated the English fleet off the Iberian coast. Somehow that never makes the history books, but we have the documentation. According to Fray Belchor, because the nuns had been trained in acts of martyrdom and mortification, they were prepared to deal with the challenge of an attack. The English invaded the north of Lisbon and threatened the Carmelites with martyrdom. The city's lay population tried to escape to a safe haven, and many encouraged the sisters to flee as well. However, the women opted to stay, for, Belchor explains, their great seraphim-like love of God inflamed them and made them immune to fear. Finally, the cardinal ordered them to leave. Although Maria was under the weather, she picked herself up and led her nuns to safety. She writes, "We abandoned our house with pain and tears, covered with our cloaks and veils, each with a small cross in her hands, with a large crucifix in front, leading the way. Upon seeing them pass in front of the royal palace, the company captains became certain of victory, animated by the squadron of the beloved brides of Christ." The nuns settled into a friend's house. Maria writes, "We were all crying rivers of tears, for it pierced our hearts to see the whole city under siege. We kept most of our regular observances, for we all proposed not to allow the devil to gloat at having thrown us out of our convent, but rather, wherever we were, to live as though we were in our own house." Finally, when she learned of an abandoned church, humid and in disrepair, she went to see it. Although it was crawling with spiders and insects, she fetched her sisters with great joy, because now they could at least practice their observances. That night they slept completely dressed and on the floor, on some woven mats. When the rumor spread that the royal palace had been mined, the city erupted in screaming and confusion, but Maria calmed the nuns. The next day, they heard banging at the door of the church, and the nuns were told to put out all the lights because they were surrounded by explosives and in great danger. They were joined by the old and weak-hearted Baltasar de Jesus, whose affliction upset the nuns. One young sister, Alberta da Madre de Deus, told them that she was surprised that he was so afraid to die, being that he was so old. "I haven't been in this world even 18 years, she said, and I'm ready and willing, even eager to die tonight if our Lord wills it. Fray Belchor adds that she raised everybody's spirits with her valor, and the old man never again showed fear. In spite of all of these conflicts and problems, many church officials held Maria in very high esteem. In 1595, the Archbishop of Évora decided to send her to the Augustinian monastery of Menino Jesus, Child Jesus, in Lisbon to deal with some unruly nuns. They were Augustinians, though. Maria's cautious response reveals shrewd political and psychological insight. She knew that the Augustinian nuns would be resentful of a Carmelite reformer. In the end, she accepted the assignment out of obedience, but to ward off gossip about her intentions, she pretended to be going to Évora to make a foundation. During this time, the French were stepping up their efforts to bring the reform to France, and Bab Akari petitioned Rome to bring nuns from the Lisbon province for that purpose. Akari, and I'm using the French pronunciation because that's the way I learned it, but it's A-C-A-R-I-E. Some of you may know her with a different pronunciation. but she was a very well-connected French noblewoman who attributed her spiritual transformation to Saint Teresa of Avila, whose works Bretigny had translated into French. Because of Acari's contacts in the French religious hierarchy, she was a cousin of Pierre de Bérulle. Again, it's Berulle, and you may have heard his name with a different pronunciation. But Bérulle was the chaplain to Henry IV, the King of France. And Acari ran a salon that was attended by St. Vincent de Paul. And they were all connected. It was all one big group. But because of her connection, she was able to advance Bretigny's project by enlisting Bérulle's help. We know that Maria de San Jose was enthusiastic about the project and wrote to Bretigny that she was, quote, all ready to go to France. However, Maria would never make that foundation. Instead, she was spirited out of Lisbon with no opportunity to say goodbye to her sisters. Boats waiting on the beach near São Alberto carried her up the coast. From there, she went to Évora and then to Talavera. When the news of Maria's departure became known in the city, many people protested. The Bishop of Coimbra ordered a court magistrate to send a galley to catch up with the boat that carried Maria and bring her back to her convent. But she turned them away. "What is this all about?" she asked. "All this clamor over a poor discalced nun. I thank the Viceroy for his favor and the goodwill he is showing me, but I ask you not to prevent my departure, for I am undertaking this journey willingly. It has been ordained by God, and I comply out of obedience." She was exhausted. She had really been persecuted for years, and she knew it was going to happen. Finally, Maria was exiled to a remote convent in Cuerva in Castile, where the prioress was instructed to receive her coldly, and a while later she fell ill and died. In 1604, a papal brief, I told you there were some bad people involved in this story. There's some real villains. Of course, I'm telling it from Belchor's perspective. He was a friend of Maria's, and it is a biased story. The way he tells the story is biased. He wants to have her canonized. Of course, that never happens. But he's clearly biased. But it's okay. So am I. In 1604, a papal brief finally made it possible to found convents in France. Bretigny and Bérulle were adamant that only Teresa's associates were fit for the task. They wanted to ensure that the original constitutions would govern the new convents. Besides, the situation in France, with the unending conflicts between Catholics and Protestants, dictated that only the most tough-minded nuns with direct ties to Teresa should go. Since Maria de San Jose had died the year before, Bretigny and Bérulle chose Ana de Jesus to head the first French foundation in Paris. Ana de Jesus chose 4 of her best nuns to accompany her, and the group did not include Ana de San Bartolomé, Teresa's nurse and secretary, in whose arms the saint had died. However, Bretigny and Bérulle insisted that she be added. From the beginning, La Bartolomé, as she was called, and that's what I'm going to call her because there are 3 Anns in this story, and it gets confusing. So La Bartolomé, as she and even Saint Teresa called her that, was conflicted about the whole project. She writes in her autobiographies that God encouraged her to take up the cross, telling her that olives and the grape must pass through the winepress of martyrdom to give their liquid. All of my friends have gone down this road. Ana's reluctance to go stemmed from both her own humility and the opposition of others, including Ana de Jesus. Her own convent was opposed to her leaving. They feared that she would have to engage with heretics. However, repeated messages from God convinced her that she must accede to Bretigny's entreaties. Anna's visions during this period reflect her vacillation. Some are disturbing. For example, God communicates to her that she must suffer in a lonely and unfamiliar land. She sees herself entering a dark place with Ana de Jesus, which convinces her of her own martyrdom. But these frightening visions are interspersed with others in which God consoles and encourages her. For example, the crucified Lord appears to her and tells her, "Daughter, take heart. I will help you and be with you." Ana writes that many times she was tempted to give up the project, but eventually she gained the support of her convent sisters and accepted the challenge. The Spanish nuns arrived in Paris on the 20th of September, 1604. Ana had intended to serve as a cook in the Paris convent, for until then she had been a lay or white-veiled sister tasked with domestic chores. However, in France, the prelates compelled her to accept the black veil in order to become a prioress in Pontoise, where she founded a convent in 1605. Ana de Jesus was opposed. La Bartolomé writes, "The prioress didn't want it. She had me in a cell a whole hour telling me things of great temerity, that I shouldn't believe the prelates, that I would cause my own damnation, that because of me the order in France and Spain would become lax and ruined." In the end, God and Teresa, through visions, convinced her to do the bidding of the prelates. But, she writes, her spirit was quite disturbed, for I was not certain of anything. Before she even arrived in town, the aldermen and people had formed a huge procession to greet her, which only serves to intimidate her more. Seeing herself in a position of leadership among extremely devout people, she doubted her own capabilities. She writes, "It was as though I were sentenced to death, and so mortified that it seemed to me that the office was infamy for me, that I had never had an occasion of more humiliation for body and soul, that I was no more than a worm." This is not the rhetorical use of self-deprecation or even a conventional expression of humility. Ana, who had never held a position of prioress or a position of leadership, felt truly daunted by her new role. Nevertheless, by February 1605, she seems to have set up house. She writes to Madame Acari, thanking her for all the things she and Bretigny have given her for the sacristy. She writes, "We're settling in as best we can. The linen is good. And the kitchen sister is so happy that even though she didn't want to come in the first place, now she's glad she did. All the nuns are kind," she explains, "and they're striving to be good daughters of St. Teresa." On the 12th of February, she writes to Berulle about receiving new novices, and around that same time to Jean de Bretigny, telling him how the nuns miss him. Ana was content in Pontoise. She writes, "I was now very peaceful in this convent." She tells a Barcelona nun that the novices are angels. Even the difference of language apparently is not a big problem. They all communicated, as though, she writes, "I understood their language and they understood mine." The nuns tell her, "Everything you've said we've understood without missing a word, and this has given us such joy that we cry." The other Spaniard in the house, Isabel de San Pablo, is also very kind, and she and Ana become very close. Very close, I'm quoting. "Recruiting is also going well," she writes. "She has so many applicants that if we had to take in all those who came to us in tears begging to take the habit, we'd have over 100 nuns." Still, Ana was not altogether comfortable in Pontoise. She was a peasant woman with no formal education. Ana de Jesus considered herself an intellectual. She even took a stand in the debates on quietism that were raging at the Sorbonne. Furthermore, the French women who entered the new Carmels were all of noble lineage. As a white-veiled nun, Ana had served as a nurse and a cook who performed manual labor. Now she sometimes felt she writes, very alone and overwhelmed with the administrative requirements of her office. She complains of being incapable and weak. Yet through prayer, she finds the strength to carry out her duties. God sometimes appears to her, but sometimes speaks to her through intellectual visions. Before long, Ana found herself involved in a passionate disagreement with Ana de Jesus over a postulant of Protestant background. In April 1605, she writes to Bérulle that Ana de Jesus is so upset about, quote, the nuns who had belonged to the Protestant religion that she is determined to leave France and go back to Spain. To make matters worse, the convent confessor in Paris was siding with Ana de Jesus. Darcy Donahue suggests that Ana de San Bartolomé may have known about Teresa's converso background, and for that reason was more inclined to look favorably on novices who were converts to Catholicism. However, it is perhaps more probable that Ana was simply following Teresa's example. Teresa never insisted on purity of lineage, and so Ana de San Bartolomé, probably accepting this model, admitted the ex-Calvinist nun Clare of the Holy Sacrament to Pontoise. In these disputes, Ana de San Bartolomé had an important ally in Pierre de Bérulle. Although much younger than she, he was ascending rapidly in the church hierarchy and becoming a very powerful man. One of the most important figures of the Catholic Restoration in France, Bérulle was a theologian and a writer with substantial influence at court. I said he was the confessor of Henry II. And the establishment of the Discalced Carmelite convents in France was one of his pet projects. In addition to being a tough fighter, Ana was a visionary and a mystic. Bérulle took her visions very seriously and even consulted her on spiritual matters. In fact, he was so taken with Ana's mystical powers that he put himself under her spiritual direction. Of supreme importance to him was Ana's connection with Teresa, who continued to guide her from the other world. Ana was, in a sense, Bérulle's link with heaven. In May 1605, Ana de San Bartolomé wrote to Bérulle from Pontoise, accusing Ana de Jesus of being uncharitable towards the ex-Calvinist nuns. The following month, she writes to him twice, stressing the seriousness of the situation. She obviously thought that Ana de Jesus was being disloyal to the Teresian notion of obedience by constantly defying Bérulle. By siding with Bérulle, Ana put herself at odds with much of the Reform leadership. Eventually, she began to feel isolated and depressed, a situation that was aggravated by the prelate's decision to remove her from Pontoise and return her to Paris as prioress because Ana de Jesus was going to Dijon to make a foundation and had to be replaced. La Bartolomé was popular in Pontoise and felt appreciated. She writes in her autobiographies that she was so popular in Pontoise that she had to leave the convent in the middle of the night to avoid protests. The morning after her departure, she writes, there was no small uproar, and most of all from the parents and relatives who had their daughters there, and they, the daughters, were quite disconsolate, the poor things. There can be no doubt that Ana's reluctance to comply with the command that she go to Paris was in part due to class consciousness. She complains that Paris is a court town and pretentious. Besides, Acari and Ana de Jesus had become close friends. This alliance between the two aristocratic women may well have made Ana de San Bartolomé feel uncomfortable. Don't forget, she was a peasant. She didn't learn how to read and write until adulthood. Furthermore, Madame Acari and Ana de Jesus disliked Pierre de Bérulle, who they believed wanted to impose his own notions of spirituality on them. Ana de Jesus had already taken a stand against a superior, Doria, during the nuns' revolt, and it's clear that she was not intimidated by prelates. Acari displayed similar self-confidence. Bérulle resented the two Carmelite friars, who had accompanied the Spanish nuns from Spain, and wrote to Acari to ask the French nuncio to have them turn back at the border, but she refused to do so. Ana de San Bartolomé had not supported Ana de Jesus during the nuns' revolt, and now she found herself once again at odds with Ana de Jesus. In her view, Ana de Jesus was straying from Teresa's teaching. She complains to Bérulle that the other Ana does not plan to found the Dijon convent in poverty. Mi padre, writes La Bartolomé, I didn't want to get into an argument with a madre, since it seems that a subordinate has no need to demand explanations, but only to obey. Nevertheless, she does write to her, but asks Bérulle to hold the letter and decide if and when to give it to her. Ana's confidence in Bérulle at this time is evident from a letter that she wrote to her friend from Avila, Inés de Jesus, in which she praises him. In the space of a few days, she writes, many heretics have converted here, a phenomenon that she credits to Bérulle. She then goes on to tell about Louise d'Abra de Raconi, an ex-Protestant from an aristocratic family who is a promising new postulant, and another excellent nun in Paris whose relatives are all heretics. Quote. Although she does not mention Ana de Jesus, she obviously is stewing over her superior's stand against Bérulle and the other Catholic converts. Ana left for Paris during the fall of 1605. She writes in her autobiography that the first year she was very peaceful, for although the nuns were all high-ranking ladies, they were very observant. However, a humiliating incident that occurred soon after Ana's arrival drove home that she herself was not a high-ranking lady. She was asked to read the breviary, but was not capable of marking the place. The aristocratic women in the Paris convent were certainly more literate than Ana, who learned to read and write in the convent. She writes that the French novices were all good readers, and they knew the breviary as well as doctors. The incident filled her with anguish. She writes, this distressed me greatly. It seemed the greatest disgrace and humiliation I've ever had, and everything was afflicting me. Ana may have been so upset over a dispute that was brewing that she reacted especially hard to this incident. Hostility had arisen over the question of confessors. This always seems to be the problem. Which eventually led to a falling out between Ana de San Bartolomé and Bérulle. Ana supported the efforts of the Discalced Carmelite leadership to bring Discalced Carmelite priests from Spain to France so that the nuns could confess with fathers of their own order. In this, she had the support of the nuns. However, Bérulle wanted to confess the Paris nuns himself, including Ana. In order to undermine Ana's authority, he devised a plan to isolate her. Using his influence as their confessor, he convinced the nuns to shun her, while at the same time forbidding her to offer spiritual guidance or even speak to the women of whom she was prioress. Although Teresa had given nuns the right to choose their own confessors, Bérulle abrogated that privilege, allowing Ana to confess only with him. Apparently, the French poets thought that Ana was getting too powerful. Their fear was, she writes, that I had all the nuns in the palm of my hand. While Teresian spirituality spoke to the inner person and sought to foster a more intimate relationship between the individual and God, Bérulle believed in a multiplicity of pious practices sprinkled throughout the day and centered chiefly around the Eucharist, and his piety was therefore rather mechanical and contrived, writes Peter Thomas Rohrbach. The danger for Bérulle was that when the friars came from France, from Spain, the nuns would follow Ana's lead and opt to confess with them, and so he, ordered by the father of lies, writes Anna. The French priest told the nuns, "Don't discuss your soul with the mother, for her spirit is not for you. She is a foreigner, and furthermore, Spanish. Don't trust her, for she wanted the friars, and they will give you a very hard time." I hope all the friars here are listening. They are harsh. Their rule is not for you. Anna does not blame the nuns for the bad treatment she was receiving. She writes in her defense of our Teresian heritage that Bérulle was sneaky. He spoke to the nuns sweetly, bad-mouthing her and the Carmelite fathers constantly. And since she writes, the poor little things knew no other prelate, they loved him and did his bidding. According to Anna, Bérulle fomented cultural tensions in the convent by reminding the French nuns repeatedly that Anna was a foreigner. They say they don't want Spanish women to govern, she says in her notes on the community in Paris, written at the very same time that she was undergoing these difficulties. In Pontoise, language and nationality had never been an issue. Even in Paris, Anna had always managed to make herself understood. Now, however, Bérulle fostered xenophobia to provoke animosity against Anna. Bérulle carried out his maneuvers completely behind Anna's back. She writes, "I knew nothing about this in the beginning. I saw the nuns withdrawing from me. Rather than the openness they had shown me, it was quite the opposite. Amazed, I told the prelate, that is Bérulle, one day that I didn't know what it was, that the nuns didn't speak of anything to me, that I found them changed in the extreme. He told me, 'It isn't necessary that they speak to you or you to them, for your spirit is bad. We don't want it to attach to them, for you have demons and hatred against us and other such things, that if I had one demon, she who consulted with me would have two.' If labeling Anna a foreigner was hurtful, demonizing her was dangerous and effective. Nuns afraid for their salvation would certainly have kept their distance. No wonder Anna had a vision in which she saw a great cross that seemed impossible to carry. She must have felt that as though her life were a cavalry. Soon Anna was prioress in name only. They say that I'm not the prioress, and that I don't care one way or another if things go well here, that they are the ones who have to govern. She complains that the prelates accept new nuns without even informing her. Women who were once cordial and respectful now treat her as though they don't know her. Even those nuns who once came to her for guidance abandoned her, since Bérulle tells them to go to the novice mistress, Madeleine de Saint-Joseph, instead. To deepen the hurt, he tells nuns of lower category. He sends nuns of lower category to her to inform her of her faults. Anna's rage against Bérulle is patent in her defense. El Bérulle started treating me like a slave, in words and deeds, every chance he got, she writes. Her use of the colloquial El Bérulle, roughly the equivalent of the Bérulle guy, reveals her disdain for the man. On the inside, I was angry at this Bérulle, she writes, but sometimes she didn't hold it on the inside. Sometimes she confronted him openly. When she accused him of altering the constitutions, he responded arrogantly, we are prelates and we can do it. We know what the order is about. And I said to him, I'm sure you're good priests, but you don't know what the order is about because you don't experience it. Go, Anna. We should probably excise that from the tape. And he said, mocking me, and who taught you that? Like Doria before him, Bérulle had decided to change the constitutions of the order, but Anna had learned from the conflict with Doria that obedience did not necessarily produce the desired results. Doria had not only managed to change the Constitution, he did make changes in the Constitution, and his successors had driven Ana de San Jose to an early grave. During this period, Anna continued to perform perfunctorily as prioress, but she felt that she was no more than one of the lowest nuns of the house. Eventually, Ana de Jesus returned to Paris and, once informed of the turmoil in the convent, requested that Ana de San Bartolomé accompany her to Flanders, where she, Ana de Jesus, was going to make a foundation. However, Bérulle opposed it, and Ana de San Bartolomé declined the invitation. Finally, in 1608, Bérulle allowed her to go to Tours to make a new foundation. Tours was in Protestant territory, which added to Anna's mortification. She writes, "The heretics took a great hatred against me and said I was a wicked woman, an idol of the papists. Once when a friend of the community rescued a prostitute and brought her to the convent church, the Protestants accused the Discal sisters of being loose women like her and of keeping their own illegitimate children in the house. Anna had to have the house inspected by a friend of the magistrate in order to prove the innocence of her nuns. Anna also felt lonely because she had no adequate confessor, no one with whom she writes, with whom I could communicate my spirit, because the one I had didn't know a word of Spanish and I didn't know a word of French." That isn't exactly true. She did learn a lot of French. If she didn't feel like speaking it, I could understand. At this time, Princess Isabel Clara Eugenia, daughter of King Philip II, and her husband, the Archduke Albert, were rulers in the Spanish Netherlands, which they were anxious to win back to Catholicism. So a constant war was going on in the Netherlands. The princess had wanted Ana de San Bartolomé to accompany Ana de Jesus to Flanders in 1608, but now Tomás de Jesus, who was in the Low Countries, insisted that she go to Flanders, thereby extricating her from Bérulle. In 1611, Anna returned to Paris and after a brief stay left for Flanders, where she founded a convent in Antwerp, where I did most of the research for this paper in the archives. Although Anna was well received in the Low Countries, other challenges awaited her there, of course. Isabel and Albert saw Spanish convents as a bulwark against Protestantism in the Low Countries, but they were unable to support the religious houses they helped found. Both Ana de Jesus and Ana de San Bartolomé write in their letters of extreme poverty and cold. The Habsburg rulers failed to supply even firewood, and the sisters were forced to burn their mantles, their cloaks, in order to survive the treacherous winters. Water was lacking as the wells froze, and food was scarce. And don't forget, these are women who are not used to that kind of cold. Spain and Portugal were bankrupt and unable to contribute to the convent's upkeep. Furthermore, Antwerp was a hotbed of Calvinist activity and constantly under attack. After falling to Protestant control in the previous century, Antwerp was brought back under Catholic rule in 1585 by Alessandro Farnese, Duke of Parma, the Governor General of King Philip II. But the Farnese triumph did not bring well-being to the city, which had suffered an economic decline and a diminishing population. During all this time, the Protestants are continuing their efforts to retake the city that they had lost and all the territory that they had lost. So not long after Ana de San Bartolomé settled in Antwerp, a conflict arose over the desire of certain Catholic English women to found a convent in that city. Just as Ana de San Bartolomé had supported the Protestant converts who wanted to become nuns in Paris, she now supported these women. She'd become friends with Anne Worsley, an English Catholic who had entered the convent earlier and professed as Anne of the Ascension. I kind of wish she'd taken another name, like anything, Isabel, but anyhow, got another Anne here. When La Bartolomé transferred to Antwerp, Anne went with her. However, they were forced to separate by a male spiritual director who became angry when Anne opposed his efforts to change the constitutions, This is an ongoing battle. Anne was forced to transfer to the new Carmelite foundation in Mechelen, and in the meantime, the exiled recusant Mary Lovell was working to found an English convent in Antwerp with the help of Ana de San Bartolomé. On the 13th of December, Ana de San Bartolomé was able to finally write to Anne that Lovell had at last acquired a house. However, a rift was developing between Anne Worsley and Mary Lovell, who apparently wanted much stricter rules than those favored by the new prioress. In 1622, the provincial Tomás de Jesus specified the details of new constitutions that would bring the nuns under the authority of the Bishop of Antwerp, a move supported by Worsley. For Ana de San Bartolomé, however, this development was a repeat of the nuns' revolt, and it was very disturbing. For her, the principle of obedience meant that the nuns had to follow the directive of their Carmelite superiors, even if they didn't agree with them. The Carmelites of Louvain and now the English Carmelites of Antwerp had separated from the hierarchy of the order and put themselves directly under the authority of the bishop. And Anna was apprehensive that the rebellion could spread. After Albert died in 1621, attacks on the Spanish Netherlands intensified. In 1622, Maurice of Nassau, Prince of Orange, attacked Antwerp. Although a storm foiled his attempt, Isabel Clara Eugenia wrote a letter to her confessor with a detailed description of the siege and crediting Anna with saving the city through her prayers. This is a really interesting letter, and I read it in Isabel's hand in the convent in Antwerp. And I'm sorry I can't go into it in great detail, but she describes how the Protestants are coming, how they're climbing up the wall, how they're going into the convent, how they're coming closer and closer. And all of a sudden, this God sends this storm because of Anna's prayers. It's just an amazing letter. So then 2 years later, Anna is once again celebrated for saving the city from Protestant forces, and again it's because of a storm. 2 years later, Anna dies. So that's the end of this part of the story. But I want to leave you with an idea of the early disciples of Teresa of Avila. They were, as she was, constantly embattled. Not only did they have to face war, opposition from the church hierarchy, and attacks by male antagonists from within their own order, they also fought among themselves, each woman citing her own closeness with the saint to bolster her position. However, these were really tough and feisty women. And in spite of the obstacles, they succeeded in spreading the Carmelite reform throughout Europe and eventually throughout the New World. Thank you.